As I said, I think CSS shadow parts and the colon state selector that maybe gets us 80, 85% of it. But there's other stuff we want to do. We want to be able to customize behavior. Sometimes we want to be able to do styling that's not possible in CSS. We want a visual effect that CSS just doesn't have, or you want to do something crazy. Now, CSS is going to get crazy cool over the next few years. If you're tracking the Houdini project within the W3C, there's going to be all kinds of abilities that you'll be able to give to people in CSS. While we're waiting for that, we generally need to write JavaScript code to do these cool effects. So we need some way of accommodating those. And then the last thing is a little bit, last sort of complaint or sort of challenge is that the magic of a web component is that it's one thing you can give to people. Like here's elix-carousel, declare a dependency on this library, import this module, you get this tag. And that's one thing you think about. That one thing, elix-carousel, that HTML tag, is going to have all the styling you need for the basic minimalist appearance and the behavior, all the touch swipe support, keyboard support, ARIA support, et cetera. Well, if you style that thing in CSS, you've just created a second artifact that your team now has to track. You've now got our carousel customizations.css. And if you want everyone, let's say you like the Elix, our navigation drawer, and you want everyone in the company to be using the same styled version of that thing, you have to remember to give them both parts, and they have to remember to use both things, like declare dependency on this Elix component, and remember to get that styling separately. So it would be cool if you could package the base component and the custom styling to create a new component, and then just give that out. So now you're back to having one thing, one artifact for people to worry about. So that's cool, but there's no native platform way to do that yet. So we're now going to leave behind the comfortable, warm world of standards and get into the wild, windy wilderness of library-specific ideas. I'm going to run through 3 that we use throughout the Elix code base, just to give you a sense of what's possible. This one and the next one are both predicated on a class. We have a very tiny little core that all of our components inherit from. And one of the services that they offer a component is the ability to define a template. Lit HTML does the same, lit element does the same thing. Ours, let's see, we had a totally generic spin box, and it was going to show a value inside of a span and then have buttons to increment and decrement. And let's just use this as an example. In our library, we would build that by extending our base class we call reactive element. And then we define a template property, and then I use a tag template literal that'll return an HTML template element. That is what will get cloned into a new shadow root when this component is instantiated. So almost every component library does something like this. This is our version of it. The thing that I want to point to, though, is just observe that this is a class, and we can subclass it to create something. Sometimes subclassing can be an effective way to create a specialized version of something. So this is how that might work in a web component. Let's say that we've got somewhere in our application's design language a button, and we observe that we've got a button style that we're supposed to use, but the spin box, the generic Elix spin box we're getting from somewhere, that has plain HTML buttons inside of it. And we want to create a variation of this spin box that's already got the custom button styling applied to those HTML buttons. So we can create a subclass of spin box, and in our template property, get the base class template and then patch it to do whatever we want. Like patching has this sort of sound of being a little edgy or risky. That's true, you have to be careful, but this particular technique is essentially appending to a template, and that generally is a pretty safe thing to do. So the result is this custom spin box will include 3 elements that were defined in the template property of the base class, and then an additional style element that was defined by the subclass. And you can go to town, you can have a class hierarchy that has multiple layers of styling. In the Elix library itself, we generally have a fairly shallow class hierarchy. We have a huge library of mixins that we can compose together to create complex classes. But subclassing and template patching like this can be a very effective way to specialize how something looks. A related technique is extending a render function. So we love React too. Like the state management model in React was sort of revelatory. And we observed that we loved that about React and we hated pretty much everything else about it. We do not want custom weird synthetic events. We want native platform DOM events. We don't want a language for defining UI that requires special build time tools. We don't want any of that. We just want state. So we defined a little class that allows us to have web components that have a state object. It's immutable. It's updated with calls to a set state method, and then that'll trigger a call to a render function. That render function here, this little spin box, gets a default state that has one member, a value member that starts out at 0. I'm not showing event handlers, but if we had click handlers on the up and down buttons, when they get clicked, they call set state and set the value up or down. When they do, this render function gets called and a little dictionary gets passed in. It's a dictionary of flags, which fields got changed since the last render. So that we don't have a virtual DOM, we don't feel we need it. This is performant enough for what we need to do. This code just checks, did the value change? If it did, take the latest value and stick it inside of that span so that it's rendered on the screen. That's all we do. Because it's just a method, we can override it. We love overriding. So let's say we want to get crazy with our spin box and we want negative numbers to show up in red. Like that's something that you cannot do in CSS. I hope there's no CSS selector, which is like selecting negative numbers. The base one is just going to render that value as is. Our conditionally red spin box subclass lets the base class do its render job so that it can put the value into the span, but then it checks the value itself. Did the value change? Oh, the value changed. Well, what is it? Is it less than 0? Then I'm going to apply custom styling. All of these are just DOM calls. There's nothing, there's no VDOM, there's nothing magic going on here, but this works. And this works at the scale of a pretty large, sophisticated component library. Okay, let's go on to our last technique. So we think parts are a pretty foundational ingredient in building components. You're trying to build up something complex from smaller parts. As we talked about before, page authors may want to style those parts, but maybe they want to just replace the element being used for that part entirely. So we can do that. We can make our components flexible enough that they expose the type of the element used at a particular point in the shadow DOM as a settable property. Okay, how would that work? Let's go back to our spin box example and our custom example. Earlier I mentioned we had a custom button that's part of our design language. Let's imagine that our design team has implemented that as an element already. Like there already is a custom dash button that we can use. And we're looking at this spin box. Wouldn't it be cool if we could take that button and use it where the plain spin box uses HTML buttons? Like we want to pass this custom button to the spin box as a parameter. Think of this as like passing a function pointer to another function. It's a little meta, but stay with me for a second. So we can expose that type, the type used at that spot in the DOM as a property and let someone set it. So if they pass in, hey, I want to use custom dash button for that button part, we will change the DOM and replace the standard vanilla plain HTML button with a custom button. We'll keep the same IDs, we'll keep the same content, everything else will be the same, but the type of the element will change. So we've sort of transmuted the plain button into a custom one. And we can even take this setting, this property, like right now, these two spin boxes are the same spin box class, same tag, same everything. All we've done is pass a property or an attribute into that. But we can also create a custom variation, a custom spin box that bakes that property value into it so that a page author doesn't have to think about it. And we can then give this to our company, and everywhere they use, they're using custom dash button to get buttons, and they can use custom dash spin dash box to get custom spin boxes, and everything will be consistent. If a designer changes the custom button, like, hey, our design language it's all 2020 now, everything's yellow, like they update the custom button class, and now all the spin boxes update too. So I mentioned that this is kind of meta. Let's see where we can take this. As I mentioned, the carousel has a prominent part called the stage. That's the thing that focuses the user's attention on one out of a set of items. It's going to say, look at this one right now. And it'll also manage the transition between those. That's a part, we can style it, but we can also replace it. So the Elix library starts with, has three very kind of simple elements, simple components that are designed to be used as a stage. There's a modal one that just flips immediately from one selection to the next. There's a crossfade one that does a CSS transition, and there's a sliding one that does a sliding transition. So for the carousel, maybe we start with this sliding stage. This thing knows how to render that transition. It knows how to add tension at either side to be cool and touch UI-like. It also supports ARIA, it supports touch, it supports trackpad, it supports the keyboard. Everything you'd want to do, this is really good at doing just that. With this element, this sliding stage element, we can pass that to our carousel and say, use this as the stage. So our carousel does all that touch, trackpad, keyboard, ARIA, etc., and it's got these adornments and it's got these dots. Well, what if we don't like that sliding effect? We have another stage, the crossfade. This is also useful in its own right. Like this would be a totally fine non-interactive slideshow. Maybe you had playing in the background of your homepage, something like that. But sometimes, let's say it's your homepage hero element. There's a big thing for visual interest. It's trying to cycle through a bunch of stuff to get a new visitor interested in something. And let's say the user sees something go by like, whoa, that was a cool thing. I want to go back to that one. Well, we can drop this crossfade stage into our carousel to play the role of that stage part. And now our carousel with the arrows and the dots, whatever, is doing a crossfade. We can swap in whatever thing we build, we can pass to this as a parameter and use that as a stage. We could use that same crossfade and drop it into a different component for a media playback experience. So these components can get recombined in a lot of interesting ways once you can treat a component as a parameter to another one. We can replace other parts. So here we've replaced the dots with page numbers, or we can replace them with thumbnails. So you can get very creative in how you express a particular idea. You could say, well, this is a carousel, but instead of dots, I want my custom widget to play that part. Our stock tabs component uses that modal stage, it's just flipping immediately to the next choice. If we style it, we might end up with something that looks like a tab navigation UI suitable for a mobile app. This is still using that modal stage, but we can drop in the sliding one. So now when the user clicks, they navigate laterally and they get all the touch gesture support for free, like no new code written. Doing this well requires stepping back from the presentation that we're used to and thinking about what's going on in a particular UI pattern. Like, what is it really about? Because when you look at things through that lens, you realize that this tab navigation UI on the left and the carousel on the right are the same exact pattern. They're both showing one thing at a time, that's that stage part, and they both have some parts that let you pick which of those items is going to be shown. So the only difference between these two things, it's all the same code. The only thing that's different is styling and which components are being used for which parts. just to run quickly through a final example, set of examples here, using that idea and using template patching and extending the render method to look at some other ways that we can customize things. So we've got a completely different general purpose pattern. I mentioned of a combo box. This is going to give the user an input element and some pop-up. Something in that pop-up is going to let the user pick a choice and stick it into the input element so that the user doesn't have to type. So what can we do with that? Well, maybe simple way to get started is to say a combo box has a list. When the user starts typing, we're going to scroll the list to the thing that the user wanted to type. This kind of UI scales up to maybe 100 items, something like that. For a bigger set, though, we have a different list. This list filters as you type. And you could use this as is as an in situ element. If your page has enough room, you can just let them do the filtering in situ. But you can also take that exact same list and hand it to the combo box and say, hey, use this for the list. And now you get a list that instead of scrolling when the user types, it's going to filter down. This particular UI would be good maybe to the scale of 1,000 items, something like that. Doesn't have to be a list. We could use a calendar. Elix has this super flexible, generic, minimalist calendar that supports all the languages that your browser supports. We pull out the names of the months and the names of the years. We even get things like England likes to have Monday be the leftmost day of the month in English calendars, while the US wants Sunday. Some countries want the weekend to start on Friday. Some countries are sad. They only have one day in their weekend. But we get all that right. So someone doesn't have to think about it. All of this is, of course, stylable, and every part that you see can be replaced. So the days in the calendar, like that's something that we can replace with something else. Maybe a day element that's going to render something custom, like custom data, data, or getting data from the server and rendering that. Like that's something that can be baked into this day element, a custom day element, and then handed to the calendar. And I can customize this calendar without having to know anything about date math. All I have to do is think about how do I want individual days expressed. If I drop in an interactive part like a button and say, hey, use this button for the day element in the calendar, now all the days are clickable and I can let the user select a date. We could even drop the whole thing inside of our combo box, and now we have a drop-down date picker. And this is way more flexible. This whole approach is way more flexible than just thinking about styling or having a few configuration options, because everything about this can be replaced. The calendar can be adapted so that the user can pick not just one date, but multiple dates, or instead of a set of dates, maybe a range of dates, or we want to have multiple months visible at a single time. Like those are the kinds of variations you would expect to see in this pattern. So we want to be able to support that. Can support custom data. Some of these things get a little out of hand. Like I don't know if a carousel in a combo box is a good idea, but it's totally possible. No work required to make this thing happen. Okay, getting a little punchy. So I hope I've been able to convince you that UI is fundamentally about variation, that variation is key in any framework that you're going to think about for building UI. When we get this right, and I think the web will eventually get this right, we're going to be able to create amazing UX, because we're finally going to be able to separate the people making parts from the people making apps. Like nobody should have to do the date math we did. Like nobody, to be able to get that calendar, it sucks. I promise you, it's terrible. You never want to write that code. And trying to get like touch events to work on Android and iOS and get everything just right and get the tension just right. When the user's pulling to the left, gotta feel like it wants to snap back. Like to get all that stuff, that's just awful, awful code to write. You should never have to write that again. So we want to have some nut jobs like us writing really good general purpose stuff, and then everybody else should just be able to use it. And it doesn't need to be Elix's components, although that would make us happy. But just like in the NPM world, like I'm going to expect that in a few years we would see 3 or maybe 5 awesome libraries of really general purpose stuff that everyone's going to be like, why would you recreate a menu? Why are you wasting time, your company's time, your time, re-implementing menus and doing a bad job of it? Like, let's just get an awesome menu and then just drop in the commands that we have and then style it the way we want. So thank you. This is everything I've just talked about is covered on the Elix site. I'm also happy to answer questions in email or Twitter. In the interest of time, I think what I'll do is rather than taking questions up here on stage, why don't I wrap up the talk and then I'll stick around so I can answer questions. Thank you.